never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit.
The story of Mastermind. Hunter worked for a man named Paul Le Roux, who is currently in U.S. police custody and has cooperated with U.S. police in a complex plan to arrest Hunter and his associates. We then became more familiar with Paul Le Roux himself, the main character of the Mastermind story. We saw how he started a very successful online drug sales business in the U.S., how he managed and expanded it with companies he had established around the world, and how he made a huge amount of money from it in 4 years. We also discussed his background, his history in technical forums, and various chat rooms in the early 2000s. We then touched upon his past, where he was born, and the conditions in which he grew up. As a teenager, he was a computer geek and later became a very talented programmer. He was a person with beautiful concerns, worried about privacy violations, and in the early 2000s, he wrote encryption software that, even after 15 or 16 years, the NSA, the U.S. security agency, has been unable to penetrate. We saw that Paul Le Roux was a person who, despite not having very good financial circumstances, worked thousands of hours on this software and then made it available to everyone for free and as open source. We later saw that Edward Snowden later used this same software and invited others to use it to protect their information. Now, in this episode, you will learn about other pieces of the puzzle of Paul Le Roux's life in the Philippines. On November 20th, 2009, someone informed a 31-year-old Filipino journalist named Mar Sapnad that a large ship carrying weapons had been seized near the coast of Mariveles. These journalists usually had connections within the police department, and such news would quickly reach them. Sapnad immediately set off. When he arrived, he gathered some information and was told that a local fisherman had reported a suspicious ship anchored near the coast to local customs officials. Senior customs officers went to inspect the ship. It was registered in Panama but flew no flag of any country. They boarded the ship, named MV Captain Ufuk. In this story, we will refer to it simply as Ufuk. They questioned the captain of the Ufuk. They found the captain to be a South African man named Lawrence John Byrne, who stated that the other 13 crew members were from the Republic of Georgia and could not speak a word of English. One of the officers noticed 20 unmarked wooden boxes on the ship. When they asked for documents like a bill of lading or a manifest, he had nothing. This made them suspicious. A better equipped and more complete team from the Customs Department, the Philippine National Police, and the Coast Guard was called in. They arrived and opened these boxes. In 3 of the boxes, they found 54 military assault rifles. In the 4th, they found 25 bayonets and 120 empty magazines. The source who tipped off Sapnad had told him that at least 16 other boxes had been unloaded and taken away by a small boat. Sapnad then pursued the matter, speaking with authorities. What he realized was that this arms shipment had already been distributed throughout the country. That year was also an election year in the Philippines, and officials feared that this wave of weapons might be a sign of impending political terrorism, riots, and unrest. Some believed that these weapons were destined for insurgent groups in the southern Philippines, such as Abu Sayyaf, a terrorist group then linked to Al-Qaeda, or other groups. News of this illegal arms shipment spread like wildfire. Evan Ratliff, the author of the story we are telling, says that last year he went to Manila, Philippines, to meet Sapnad. He had already read Sapnad's reports and was prepared. His curiosity stemmed from the fact that the events following the seizure of this ship marked a turning point in Paul Le Roux's case. The seizure of this ship and the subsequent events transformed Paul Le Roux from a businessman operating in a gray area, whose work was partly legal, partly illegal, and who was making hundreds of millions of dollars from online drug sales. into a despot with an insatiable appetite for crime and villainy at the head of an international criminal cartel of his own making. The incident of the MV UFOC and what followed it was in fact the cornerstone of the type of unrestrained violence that later became. Paul Le Roux has hallmark and the starting point of events that ultimately led to his downfall. Mastermind, this same journalist, gradually became a key player in this story and even came close to paying a very high price for his initial curiosity. Evan Ratliff, the author, says that when he went to visit Mastermind, he was at his office. His job was to be the media consultant for the governor. He had neat, short black hair, wore thin-framed glasses, and a black and orange plaid shirt with his pen tucked between his shirt buttons. His demeanor, despite his unibrow and a crease between his eyebrows, and a somewhat stern look, was always very cheerful and lively when he started talking, even when describing the deadly consequences of the story he had written. He said, "Our job as investigative journalists is not to care who we upset, whether we are threatened or intimidated, but we must do our work." He sat in his office on a leather sofa, with a picture of the provincial governor, his boss, above his head. He recounted how, in 2009, he gradually learned from his police sources about this case. He said that during interrogations, the ship's captain, Byrne, stated that they had not long received the ship from another captain, a British sailor named Bruce Jones. He said that when the customs officials and Coast Guard came for the ship and then seized it, Bruce Jones had not long fled with 16 boxes of weapons and ammunition. He said they were transporting the weapons for a company in Manila, an arms brokerage firm called Red, White, and Blue Arms Incorporated. We will refer to it as Red, White, and Blue. The evening before the ship was seized, a small yacht called Mementi departed from a nearby pier in a town called Subic Bay. It arrived at Bruce Jones's ship, loaded the 16 weapons, and left. The yacht Mementi was found a few days later anchored in a very remote fishing village, but neither Jones nor the guns were found. After that, the Philippine police launched a national program to pursue Bruce Jones, circulating his name and photo everywhere. 5 days after the MV UFOC was seized, a family friend of Mastermind named Joffrens Junique called him. Junique was a well-known lawyer in their town. He told Mastermind that he was calling on behalf of Bruce Jones, the captain who had fled with the ship and the weapons. He had gone and hidden in the forests high up in the mountains and wanted to see Mastermind. He wanted to meet with Mastermind, interview him, and tell the world that he had no connection to this illegal weapons program or smuggling. Mastermind agreed and said, "Very well." The next day, he set off towards the mountains, into the forests, to the address he was given. He arrived at a small villa, a small house in the middle of the trees, and there he met Jones and Junique. From there, the three of them drove to a local restaurant near the house. There is a photo of this meeting showing them sitting around a table with a red and white checkered tablecloth. Bruce Jones was wearing a lemon yellow t-shirt. In the photo circulated for his capture, he had long, disheveled hair, but he had cut and tidied it. Mastermind said that night he was very distraught and could burst into tears at any moment, and all he kept saying was, "I am not a terrorist." Then Jones told Mastermind his life story. He said he was 49 years old and had come to the Philippines from Bristol, England in 1993. He had married a 25-year-old Filipino woman named Maricel and lived outside of this small town of Subic. This town, like many other towns we hear about in this story, was formerly a U.S. military base. This is almost a common feature of all these small Philippine towns where the story takes place. They were all previously U.S. military bases. This one was a U.S. naval base. When the news of Jones's predicament and pursuit reached his home country, Bristol, journalists naturally went to interview his former friends, acquaintances, and employers. They all said that he was a good person and not at all capable of such things. However, one of his former employers made an interesting remark, saying that he was a very good person but always seeking adventure. There was always something in his personality that made him think he would get into trouble. Then Jones said that his trouble occurred in August 2009 when another Briton named David Smith approached him and told him to take a ship from Turkey to Indonesia and then from Indonesia to the Philippines. There was a Filipino company called La Plata Trading that would pay his travel expenses, his salary, and provide a full crew for the ship. Smith himself handled all the arrangements for Jones. He flew to Turkey, took delivery of the MV Ufuk there. It was a rusty ship but seaworthy, 2,400 tons, with a Georgian crew. From there, they set sail, stopping at the coast of Africa, with a stop in Ghana and another in Congo. Then they continued south around the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost coast of South Africa, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. From there, they turned back north and headed towards Indonesia. In the port of Jakarta, he said he received the cargo. He said the arms shipment was from a company called PT Pindit. From there, he headed towards the Philippines. Jones told Supnad, "I was sure that this arms shipment was completely legal. They had given me an end-user certificate, which is a document showing that the weapons were legally purchased and who they were being delivered to. It showed that the buyer was in Mali." He also said that 50 Indonesian police and soldiers in Jakarta supervised the loading. This made me think that I had no doubt that this work was completely legal. Evan Ratliff, the author, says, "I later found a document in the WikiLeaks archives confirming that the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta had approved this arms deal with the Indonesian Ministry of Defense." Later, as Jones approached his destination, someone contacted him, claiming to be the owner of La Plata Trading, a person he had never met before. He told him to delay his arrival, to wait a bit. The next day, he called him again and told him to divert his course and go towards Subic Bay and wait there until they told him where to dock. So he went that way, and then he waited and waited, but no news came. Several days passed with no news. Jones started to get worried. His wife was also pregnant and could give birth any day. He told the ship's owner, "Sir, I want to leave now." After he said he wanted to leave, that same night, the Mementi boat with David Smith on board arrived. They launched a rubber motorboat next to the Ufuk. They disembarked Jones, boarded Byrne, the South African captain, and removed 16 boxes of ammunition from the ship. The motorboat took Jones back to shore. When news of the ship's seizure reached the media, they pieced together the limited information they had and concluded that Jones was the mastermind behind the operation, whereas he was merely an employee working for those large companies, and those large companies were in fact an international criminal organization. Jones, who had somewhat understood the magnitude of the international criminal organization he was dealing with, fled to the mountains out of fear for his life. In that same meeting, Jones told Supnad, the journalist, that this organization had a lot of money and a lot of power. Its owner, he was told, had 3 passports. Supnad said that Jones had very good information and was very willing to talk. He took notes on everything. He wrote a report, and on August 26, 2009, Supnad published this report stating that the English captain of this arms transport ship was now seeking protection and had a lot to say. 2 weeks later, Jones, accompanied by lawyer Junique, went to the customs office and surrendered. There he told them that La Plata Trading had hired him through David Smith, and his mission was to buy this ship for $800,000 in Turkey, go to Indonesia, buy $86,000 worth of weapons in Indonesia, and take them to the Philippines, which was the same story he had told Supnad. In February 2010, the Philippine government filed charges against 37 individuals, including Byrne, the South African captain, the English Jones, and the Georgian crew for the illegal entry of weapons into the Philippines. However, they were not alone in the case. Other individuals were also included, such as the owners of La Plata Trading and Red, White and Blue, David Smith, Michael Archangel, and a person named Johan. Junique Jones's lawyer requested that he be taken into protective custody, stating publicly that he was concerned for his client's safety and life, arguing that he was a victim, not a criminal. Jones had very limited contact with Paul Le Roux's network, but that brief interaction was enough to greatly frighten him. Between 2007 and 2011, Paul Le Roux's businesses had metastasized and simultaneously grown rapidly in many different areas: logging and forestry, precious stone mines, gold smuggling, land deals, cocaine trafficking, and arms dealing. He conducted these activities through a network of 10 to 12 satellite companies, each registered in a different part of the world. When we put this information together, some areas intersect. For example, some Israelis working in a call center in Tel Aviv were given the task of doing something for an international forestry company. They hired some of their friends who were sent to Hong Kong to guard some houses where gold was stored, or one of them was sent to Brazil to establish a company there. Names seen in documents related to drug sales companies later appear in documents for companies involved in arms dealing or money laundering. The person who helped Evan Ratliff, the author, connect all this information is Lulu, Paul Le Roux's relative, whom we mentioned in previous episodes. She herself contacted the author in March of this year and told him many stories. Lulu said that she had lost contact with Paul Le Roux in the early 2000s. Their connection had been severed. Later, in 2007, Lulu contacted him about a job offer. Over the next year, Lulu saw many of Paul Le Roux's different operations and became acquainted with many of the key people working in his companies, including Joseph Hunter, whom we heard about in previous episodes. How he was arrested in Phuket, how their safe house was bugged, his role in the killing of the two Filipino women, and ultimately how he was arrested, the story of his trial, his plea of guilty, and all those stories. In March of this year, a former employee of Lulu also sent Evan Ratliff 80 pages of chats he had with her. In these chats, Lulu talks about various things, including extracting gold from the Democratic Republic of Congo, buying planes, or acquiring RPGs. In one chat, it's summarized as, "I want 2 RPG-7 South, 10 grenades, this much explosives, 4 MP5s, each with 2 15-round clips of ammunition. This is a small order, just a sample to see if we can deliver. I want you to get these to me in Mozambique. I'll pick them up from there and take them to Asia." None of the people Evan Ratliff interviewed for the story know how Le Roux got into the arms business. However, one thing is clear: his organization was full of former soldiers and military personnel from various armies. At the top of his organizational hierarchy, he was very close to a man named David Smith, a British national who had done security work in Iraq and later worked for a risk management company in the Philippines. It was said that he had an American passport and was originally American or English. It appears that Paul Le Roux hired David Smith before 2008 and gradually made him his all-purpose assistant and senior advisor. All tasks related to, for example, gold transportation and getting rid of troublesome individuals were entrusted to him. It was this same David Smith who in 2009 stood over Moran Oz as we said Oz had been thrown into the sea. And David Smith had the phone in his hand telling him that he had stolen the boss's money and that if he made a mistake they would bring his daughter. One of Paul Le Roux's former employees, Gil, whom Evan Ratliff met in Manila, is mentioned in this report. Gil says that Paul Le Roux once told David Smith in front of him, "I live vicariously through you." He says, "This was exactly what we saw." Le Roux mostly sat behind a computer. David Smith was the man of action in the field. A person like David Smith allowed Le Roux to access a network of soldiers and military personnel working for security companies and private security contractors. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were wars with many security contractors. The U.S. Army outsourced contract work to private companies. After leaving these countries, these so-called security contractors spread throughout the world. For example, one South African man who later worked for Le Roux's company says, "One of my colleagues working in Iraq sent me an email saying they were looking for snipers and people for protection and guard duty. I sent my resume, and they told me to come to the Philippines next week." Such people were used, for example, to protect valuable cargo or even for human trafficking. In one of the chats, of which there are many, Paul Le Roux tells one of them, "I have an important deal in Papua New Guinea. I need a good white girl. I promised her to a local governor. It's very, very vital for my work." There are countless similar chat examples in the documents. It's very interesting that this person, who is so concerned about security, and was always worried and saying to switch from this chat program to that chat program, sometimes acted carelessly. For example, at one point he said, "You don't need to encrypt in Skype. You can talk easily." Skype is encrypted, but later he changed his mind again and told everyone to use another messaging application or an email service he had written himself. However, the fact that we have access to his chats today shows that he wasn't as careful as he should have been. Another thing these messages show, amidst all the information and knowledge this person possessed in various fields and traditions, is that on a single day, you see him chatting with different people. With one, he's haggling about customs regulations in Congo. With another, he's discussing the price of copper on the London Metal Exchange. And with another, he's debating which brand of crane to buy for the forestry project in Africa. Music. One of the strangest things seen in these chat logs is how gradually he became cold-blooded about violence, how nonchalant and indifferent he became about expressing violence. At one point, he's discussing with someone in a very normal way, asking if the person who owes him money has children. Lulu herself recounts that at one point, she became very worried that she was also in danger. Two of the people he had hired in Africa lost a large sum of money in a deal, and Paul Le Roux blamed Lulu for this. One time he called her and told her to come to Manila. Lulu went there, but Paul Le Roux didn't show up for their dinner appointment. Lulu says, "That same night I heard that another person we worked with had been arrested. I got very worried. I quickly went back to the airport, took the first flight to Hong Kong, found a hotel, checked in, and went to my room. The phone in the room rang. I picked it up and it was Paul. He asked why I ran away. I immediately put the phone down, checked out, and ran towards the airport. I looked for the first flight. It was to Bangkok. I took it and went to Bangkok, got a hotel, and went to the hotel." He says the same story again. "I had no idea how he was tracking me. I went to another country, which he still doesn't say where he went. I went to a friend's apartment and hid there. I wanted to see what Paul was after. Then," he says, "suddenly I chatted with Paul Le Roux and told him I thought he was after me. He says Le Roux sent a smiley face and said, 'Son, if I was after you, you'd be dead by now.' Lulu says, 'I never saw him after that, and I lived in fear for 5 years. Journalist Mar Subnad's report on his meeting with Jones was widely covered by both Filipino and international media. However, it wasn't long before the threats began. At first, they were very friendly. A fellow journalist invited him to a coffee shop in Subic Bay and told him to take $10,000 and stop writing about the UFOC. Subnad later wrote about this incident in an article and explained that he was told that the Philippine National Police and the Department of Justice would pursue the arms smuggling case on the condition that there would be no more disclosures and the media would not drag it out. A little later, another offer came. They approached Subnad's editor and told him that Subnad should take a 3-month recreational trip to Hong Kong or Macau, wherever he liked, with all expenses paid by the company in exchange for not writing anything more about the UFOC ship. Again, Sapnad refused, and his editor supported him, saying, "Write whatever you want to write." However, Sapnad gradually became worried. He started changing his daily routes. He no longer went near the Subic Bay Pier. He constantly changed his car's license plate. He was very careful when entering and leaving his home. Sometimes he wore a hat. He had heard that officials had received a huge sum of money to whitewash this case, especially the important individuals whose names appeared in the case. He wasn't as vigilant. He had regained some confidence and felt that they were no longer pursuing him. In September 2010, a year after Jones had spoken with the police, he decided to come out of hiding. On the morning of September 21st, he took his wife and children to a shopping mall in Angeles City, another city that was also a former U.S. military base. There, they were scheduled to meet an American named John Nash and his wife. They were also family friends and had known each other from Subic Bay. John Nash owned a security company there that provided guards for places like the Ocean Adventure water park. This area, in general, is attractive to these former military personnel, especially for Western men who want to live in a tropical, affordable place with a very active sex trade. Someone in the area who knows these foreigners well says that whenever they ran into problems, they would go to John Nash. He spoke 5 Filipino dialects very well, and there were some rumors, probably spread by himself, that he had previously worked for the CIA. Many people didn't believe it, but in any case, he seemed to be a connected person. The incident that happened on September 21st was that at 2 p.m., the group finished their lunch. Jones and his wife got into their gray Mitsubishi Lancer, and Nash followed them a few minutes later. Their plan was to meet again at a nearby shooting range. The car turned onto Don Jose Street. 100 meters from the entrance to the shooting range, a Honda XR motorcycle with 2 people wearing helmets came up behind them. As the car slowed down for a speed bump, the motorcycle pulled alongside the car, then in front of it. The person sitting on the back of the motorcycle stood up, leaned forward, and started shooting through the driver's window. When he finished, he sat back down and they quickly fled. Jones was shot multiple times. 1 bullet passed through him and hit his wife, who was sitting next to him, in the back. Jones collapsed on top of her, spitting blood. Maricel was startled, horrified, and panicked. She opened the door, threw herself out, and in terror, called John Nash. He quickly arrived, pulled Maricel and the child out of the car, and immediately rushed to the hospital. The child was perfectly fine. Maricel's condition was quickly stabilized by the doctors, but Jones died right there in the car. 5 years after the incident, Evan Ratliff, the author, says, "I went there and saw the crime scene. I also saw the police reports. The police who had come to investigate that day said that the sound of the shooting range provided a very good cover for someone who wanted to shoot in that street in the middle of the day because the sound wouldn't be noticeable. It wouldn't attract much attention." The documents also showed that 45 caliber shell casings were found next to the car, and some crime scene photos taken that day showed that the shooter was very close to the car window. However, there isn't much other evidence. 2 people on a motorcycle attacking someone is a very common method for assassinations in the Philippines, partly because the person wearing a helmet can escape very quickly and their identity cannot be easily identified. One of the people the police interrogated that day was John Nash. Nash said that Jones had told him he had been threatened and had noticed some suspicious movements around his house. His suspicion was that these were related to the owners of the UFO ship. At the time Bruce was killed, Paul Le Roux was looking for people who could carry out international operations, both legal and illegal, and for this, he reached out to several groups of people. Some Israelis whom he mostly hired for call centers, some of his relatives like Lulu, and a group of people from South Africa or Zimbabwe. The story of a Zimbabwean engineer named Robert McGowan is also similar. In 2007, McGowan heard that a wealthy South African man was looking for someone to help him buy equipment for a forestry project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he paid well. But before this project even started, Paul Le Roux told McGowan that he needed to do a few other things, register a few more companies here and there, in Hong Kong and in the US. We will use these companies to prepare the way, I don't know, move trees, buy equipment, things like that. I had many questions about what these companies were really going to do, what we were going to buy. Everything was not very clear to me. Evan Ratliff interviewed McGowan a few months ago. McGowan said, "I did everything I could to be persistent and to be transparent and direct. I first flew to Hong Kong, opened a company called Tycoon Limited, then started looking for logging machines. I found a very good one in Texas. Then," he says, "Paul Le Roux paid me a lot of money to go to America and set up companies there so I could buy things there and export them from there and bring them over here. 2 separate companies." He says, "When I arrived in America, I saw that he had done all the work, all the legal and bureaucratic work. The only thing I needed to do was open an account in my name at the bank. And I did that." As we tell McGowan's story, let's also remember that someone like McGowan knew nothing about the UFO boat incident. Everything was highly compartmentalized and categorized. Each person only knew about their limited area of work and had no information about other parts. Paul Le Roux's former employee Gil says, "I wasn't looking to see if the work was 100% legal or not. Of course, I said no to some tasks. For example, some tasks involving methamphetamine transport, I said I wouldn't do it. But most of the other tasks I considered unethical, probably incorrect, but I had already gotten involved, so I did them. Of course, it wasn't always that everything was separate. Sometimes Le Roux mixed businesses simply because it was easier to execute. For example, in 2009, he assigned McGowan, who was involved in the logging and forestry business, the task of going to Israel to set up a new call center in Tel Aviv with Moran Oz. Many of the operations Paul Le Roux carried out, the businesses he pursued, seemed fantastical. Lulu says that one time he called her and said, "I want a list of all agricultural lands in Zimbabwe." She says, "I couldn't understand what he would need such a list for." Later, she understood that he wanted this to implement a program to lease these lands from the Zimbabwean government under a leasing agreement, and then to return those farmers, those landowners who had lost their land after the end of the colonial period and after the end of white minority rule in the early 80s and were thrown out, to their lands. To achieve this, Le Roux had asked an Israeli named Levi Kugel to pay an international lobbyist. Kugel had found a former Mossad agent named Ari Ben-Menash, who was very close to Robert Mugabe, the then president of Zimbabwe. Paul Le Roux had paid Ben-Menash $12 million to lobby Mugabe on this issue. What he wanted was for this injustice to be rectified, and the land reform program was supposed to correct things. Lulu says, "This issue was very hot and closely followed for a while, and then suddenly there was complete silence. The case died completely. No one ever heard anything about it again." Something very similar happened with the forestry business. In late 2009, he suddenly dropped this project and never spoke to McGowan again. McGowan says, "I actually traveled to Manila to see what was going on. Many people told me not to go, it was dangerous, etc. I said, I haven't done anything wrong, I'm going. It was a cat and mouse game, go this way, go that way. I just wanted to see him, and I wasn't sure if I was chasing him to see him. I wasn't sure if they were following me or not. And finally, I managed to see him. I asked him what was going on. He said, 'No, I want us to work together again.' But after I returned, it was as if nothing had happened, and that was the last time we had contact." Evan Ratliff, the author, says, "I first came across McGowan's name when I was looking at company documents, the CSYY in Israel and Armada and Quality, Fountain in the US, he himself knew about these companies and had registered them. But there were other companies registered in his name that he had no idea about. When I told him about one, he said, "I just Googled it. It's a company called AB Systems, registered in my name." He says, "I had never heard of this company before I received your email." Another company he had never heard of was called Southern Ace. This company eventually plays a very strange role in Somalia, a permanent member of the short list of the most dangerous, brutal, and lawless countries in the world. Now, what is this story? The story is that in 2010, the UN Security Council sent a team of inspectors to Somalia to assess the unstable situation there and to understand the issue of piracy. This team, led by a Frenchman named Paul Le Roux, went there and found some very horrifying and disturbing things, including that private security companies were flourishing there. They were armed, had money, and it was unclear what they were doing. Among these private companies was a company called Southern Ace. In their report, they wrote that Southern Ace began its work in the Galmudug region of central Somalia in 2009. It introduced itself as a company that imported fishing equipment to Hong Kong. But in reality, the company began recruiting local military forces, arming them, giving them RPGs, vehicles equipped with heavy weapons, Kalashnikovs, importing uniforms for them, bulletproof vests, and providing them with radios. And documents from the Somali government show that Le Roux and his group concluded that a person named Paul Keller Le Roux, also known as Bernard John Bolin, was the owner of this company. Another thing Le Roux had found was that Paul Le Roux had obtained permission to land an Antonov aircraft at a local airport in Galmudug and, through that, import explosives and mines, 1 million rounds of ammunition, 583 tank missiles, and a full range of military weapons. The idea of a foreign private company starting to build its own military force in the middle of another country was completely outrageous. Le Roux says that the area was so dangerous that no one from the UN had previously gone there, and the situation was completely out of control. This company, Southern Ace, had arrived very independently and surprisingly, had started, taken root, and become very powerful. The situation became even stranger. This military group, supported by Paul Le Roux, had long-standing disputes with another tribe there. In November 2010, they formally went to war. A rural tribe against another tribe in their neighborhood. This war, lasting several days, caused very heavy casualties for both sides. It's a very strange story that Paul Le Roux, sitting in the Philippines, conducting his business and making money, would get involved in a war between two tribes in Somalia and pay for it there. The author asked many people what Paul Le Roux was really after in Somalia, but even the people hired by Southern Ace don't have a clear understanding of the matter. Gil says he heard that Paul Le Roux's plan was to occupy the Maldives, an island in the Indian Ocean. He wanted to create an army, bring a former president of the Maldives back to power, make him his puppet, and then establish himself there and manage his operations worldwide from there with no one bothering him. Like many of Paul Le Roux's other stories, this one, at first, seems more cinematic than real. Evan Ratliff says that he didn't take the story seriously at first. He thought it was one of those stories that military-minded people tell after a few drinks. Let's occupy this place, occupy that place, and so on. But later, when he was reviewing the transcript of Joseph Hunter's words in the safe house, he saw that he also said this to the assassins he was hiring. Yes, we were building an army in Somalia because the boss wanted to occupy an island, the Maldives. These things are real. You don't even see these things in movies. The plan, of course, seems very strange ... to occupy it, the Maldives. These things are real. You don't even see these things in movies. The plan, of course, seems very strange. The Maldives is 3,000 kilometers from the coast of Somalia. But in any case, what we know is that he actually created this group in Somalia and imported a large quantity of weapons, military weapons, and armed them. The United Nations report, however, says something else. Le Roux states in that report that he thinks this person wanted to do things in Somalia. At that time, it was the peak of maritime piracy, and we think he wanted to establish a private security company on the coast of Somalia and charge shipping companies money to protect them from piracy. For more about the nature of Somali piracy, how they hijacked ships, what they did, and how their operational system worked, listen to the second episode of Channel NARRA podcast if you haven't already. It was called Run or Die. The story of the crew of the MV Albedo also explains in interesting detail how this piracy system actually worked. This project then failed. When it failed, Le Roux's people turned to cultivating illicit plants such as coca, opium poppies, and cannabis. Some also say that Paul Le Roux's next plan was to start coca cultivation and cocaine production in Somalia. This company, Galson, imported greenhouses, chemical herbicides, and agricultural equipment from all over the world. Then Le Roux says that Le Roux suddenly abandoned this project as quickly as he had started it. Why did he abandon it? When he was told that the ex-military personnel he had hired were being paid only $30, while the market rate was $150. After spending several $million in Galmada, he suddenly abandoned every plan and program he had for that place in mid-2010 and abruptly left Somalia. Locals attacked those bases, took the weapons that were there. One of the company's employees was killed in a shootout, and everything ended. When Lulu recounts this story, she says, "Yes, that's how it is." She says, for $150 per person, he suddenly cut everything off and left. Paul is such a person. When the results of Le Roux's team's investigations were published in 2011, there was a barrage of articles and reports in international media. Everyone was looking for the mysterious South African businessman. The name that came up most in these reports was Robert McGowan. He says, "Suddenly I saw the name of the company I managed everywhere." Evan Ratliff, the author, says, "When I found the United Nations report, I started reading it carefully to see if I could find any point that would connect it to the research I had already done, to see if it completed any part of my puzzle, or not. Then he found it. Somewhere in the report, it says that at least $500,000 was deposited for the company S establishment from March to June 2009 by Paul Le Roux's company in the Philippines, called La Plata Trading. At this point, all the names were familiar to him. La Plata Trading, the company that paid for the weapons procurement in Somalia, the same company that sent David Smith to hire Bruce Jones to sail the MV Ufuk from Turkey to Indonesia and then to the Philippines. He says, "When I reached this point, I said I should do another search to see how Bruce Jones' S-Lawyer was doing and contact him. Maybe he had a clue about this Somalia incident." The first result Google gave me stunned me. It was the headline of a Filipino news website in July 2012 that said, "Where is lawyer Joffrance Junike?" On June 20th, this well-known local lawyer left his home and never returned. 2 months later, Evan Ratliff says, "I went back to Manila again. I went to see the head of the special investigation team at the police department. The case file was very small and limited. The last time Junike was seen was at 11:45 am on June 20th. He had a meeting with 2 men, one named Timothy Desmond, the general manager of the Ocean Adventure Water Park, and the other, John Nash, the head of security for Ocean Adventure." Then this police officer told the author, "Yes, John Nash and Junike were very close. And now John Nash is the last person to have seen Bruce Jones alive and the last person to have seen Joffrance Junike alive. The core of the matter is that Bruce Jones, red, white, and blue, was the company that was the final buyer of the weapons that Ufuk was bringing." Lanthuk's phone rings. As he reaches for the phone, 4 people surround his car and shoot him with a Uzi. He drives another 100 meters until he hits a concrete wall and dies instantly. His wife later told the newspaper that, yes, he had recently been involved with a company in the arms business and was always trying to get out, but he couldn't. A year later, a man named Jimmy Panyar confesses to killing Lonthuk, saying that he and 3 others had tried to kill him 5 times before without success, and finally, that day they were able to carry it out. The cost of the assassination was paid by a person whom police reports from then on began to refer to as Mastermind. Then the police officer told me that in my investigations, I must have encountered the name Herbert Antinio. Police reports showed that some of the weapons from this shipment were later found in this man's apartment. I said, yes, I saw this, and later I saw police reports saying that in October 2010, the police raided his house and found the Indonesian-made weapon shipment that had arrived on the MV Ufuk in this man's house. I said, I don't know what happened to him. What became of him? Where is he? The police said that he is also missing. This means that in the 2 years since the seizure of the Ufuk, 2 of the people who had information about this deal and this shipment disappeared in broad daylight, in the middle of the street. It's clear to the author that Paul Le Roux is behind the disappearance of people who know something about the Ufuk, but there is no strong evidence. One day, Evan Ratliff says that someone helped him get into the residential area where Paul Le Roux lived in Dasmarigas. He says, we passed by his house. His house, contrary to what I had heard before, was an unpretentious house. Of course, there were CCTV cameras around it, but the high walls showed that they hadn't been maintained or cleaned for a long time. I spoke with a local guard who said, I don't remember much about Paul Le Roux, except for one very strange incident. That was when we caught someone here who wanted to steal a motorcycle. The guard didn't give many details, or didn't have any. I came home and later investigated, and I saw that, yes, this had also been published in a local newspaper. The story was that a Filipino man named Ronald was arrested for attempting to steal a motorcycle from the security of this residential area. When they caught him, they opened his backpack and found very strange things there. Some questionable documents, a helmet, a camera, and a large number of fake identification cards. Then they saw that his face resembled the person who had been profiled, and they said that they had seen him stalking Michael Lonthuk a few hours before he was assassinated. When the police caught him, one of the first people they contacted was the journalist Mar Sabnad. He says, they called me and said that they found an assassination list in this man's backpack, and you are the first person on that list. He says, as soon as I heard this, I went to the prison to see the man they had arrested. I didn't tell him who I was, of course. I said, for example, I'm a police officer. I've come to see what information you have. Maybe I can help you. He told him, it wasn't my job to kill him. I was given a list and I was supposed to gather information. Someone else was supposed to carry out the assassination. Then he asked him, who hired you for this? He said, David Smith. At the same time, the investigation into the Ufuk case practically failed. The Georgian crew were eventually sent back to their country, and documents show that by 2014, all files, including those created for Paul Le Roux, had been archived. Only one person was convicted in the middle of this, Lawrence John Byrne, the South African captain. He also posted bail and was released, and then he fled and has not been found since. Everyone we talked to in the Philippines says that Le Roux had severe immunity, and many police officers are unwilling to work on this case due to intimidation, threats, or bribery because they say people disappear in this case. Gilda Mann, who was in Manila and had previously worked with him, says that Paul Le Roux paid a lot of money to these Filipino officials to protect himself and to run his business there, and also to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. It's not clear to what extent, but he spent a lot of money. Let's return to Robert McGowan. His situation is that he is contacting many equipment suppliers for forestry projects, buying many things, then the project is canceled. And then he realizes that the company he registered in Somalia has appeared in United Nations reports, and the reports state that this company is involved in arms trafficking and drug production. He panics. Then he calls the Israelis with whom he registered the company to get some information from them. They also call him and tell Paul Le Roux not to pay him any attention. Then he tries another way. There was a famous lawyer in the U.S. whose wife was friends with McGowan's wife. He contacts him and says, "Sir, my situation is like this. I need to sever all ties that connect me to this man. Companies in Israel, companies in the U.S., in Hong Kong. I'm sure this man has access to my email. Once, in a conversation, he asked for my mother's nickname, and I'm sure he used that to get into my email. My problem is that I can't go to the other side of the world and close these companies. It costs a lot of money. Or, for example, I can't hire a lawyer to pursue these matters for me." Then he tells this lawyer that these are very dangerous people. If I go and talk to law enforcement in the U.S., they can protect me. These people must be stopped. Justice must be served, but I really don't want to put myself and my family at risk. The lawyer tells him, "What you are describing, in simple terms, means that your identity has been stolen." The more precise logic of the story is that the person who stole your identity is an international assassin and a major trafficker. Then he connects him to some people in the U.S. judicial system. Their logic also says, "You are in Africa. We cannot guarantee your safety in Africa." Then, in 2014, John Nash, a friend of two of the victims in the story, is going to a small coastal town. A SUV comes in front of him and blocks his way. Before he can reverse, another one comes from behind and pins him. 7 armed police officers jump out of the car, pull him out, and take him back to Manila in a private SUV. John Nash's arrest operation was carried out very interestingly. They suspected that this man had connections within the police departments, which is why the operation was kept very secret. So secret that the next morning, the local police were looking for where he was. Now, the reason for his arrest is more interesting than the method of his arrest. When they go after John Nash in the Junike case and he becomes a suspect, the police contact the U.S. Embassy in Manila because he had an American passport. The embassy's response is that the passport he is using belongs to a deceased person. Therefore, they cancel the passport and the police arrest him. Evan Ratliff says, "When I sat down and interviewed the police about this case, John Nash had been in custody for 18 months and they didn't have enough information to convict him, and the only thing against him was this illegal immigration. However, on the other hand, since he doesn't give them any other name or nationality, there is nowhere else they can deport him. It's unclear where they should send him back. The police don't know who he is or where he came from. No matter how hard they tried to find a country that will accept responsibility for him, they get nowhere except for the US. They contact Britain, Australia, and South Africa, but to no avail." Even more interesting, Timothy Desmond, the general manager of the water park who hired him for security there, is also on the run. The story of the water park involves someone who was conned and he disappeared. The photos of John Nash show a man in his 50s, well-built, with a shaved head. The most important question for these Filipinos, however, is, please tell us, where did this man come from? They also seek help from the author, saying, "Sir, can you help us, for example?" The only clue we have is a tattoo of a bulldog smoking a cigar on someone's arm. They say, "Come, let's see if we can find something from this." That's John Nash. Junike Gill says that he once asked Paul Le Roux about Jones, saying, "I don't understand why we killed this captain." He said he wanted to testify. I told him his wife and children were in the car. He said, "We didn't kill them." The truth is that no one was safe from Paul Le Roux's evil nature, not even those closest to him, like David Smith. In the years following the Ufufuk incident, There were rumors that Smith had started siphoning off some of the drugs or gold he was transporting for Paul Le Roux, taking small amounts here and there. Gill says, "I think Smith himself had started using drugs. His mental state was also affected by the fact that he wasn't really making much money, and the work he was doing was very demanding. He was always the number 2 man, the number 2 in the entire organization." Then, at some point, Paul Le Roux took action. Gill's account is that David Smith was caught outside a bar while drunk, thrown into a van, taken to a place outside the city, put into a grave that had been dug beforehand. He was given a phone, and on the other end of the line was Paul Le Roux, who told him, "See what happened in the end?" Then he was shot right there and buried there. Gill says, "Sometime later, I had dinner with Paul at a Hard Rock Cafe in Manila. He told me, 'I think you know what's happening. I don't need Dave anymore. You're lucky I need you.'" In the transcript of Hunter's conversations, there is also a reference to Dave's story. Hunter tells someone, "Dave lost his life because he started stealing. Then I came in his place. I'm doing his work now, producing Namlik." Every week, one episode of the Mastermind podcast series is uploaded simultaneously on Namlik, ME and SoundCloud. Introduce Channel NARRA to anyone you think enjoys new and real stories. Follow Channel NARRA Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram with the identifier at Channel NARRA_. Podcast to stay informed about new episodes and to receive photos, documents, and additional supplementary material about the Mastermind story and other stories previously told on the podcast. Channel NARRA Podcast. Channel NARRA Podcast.